Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Tochukwu Ezeokana, and this is a video interview sponsored by the International State Crime Initiative, ISCI. And today I will be interviewing Professor Hedi Viterbo. Welcome, Hedi. Thank you for taking out time to meet with me today. So Hedi is a friend of Hedi is a friend of ISCI and has just very recently written a book titled Problematizing Law, Rights, and Childhood in Israel-Palestine. So could you tell us, Hedi, what made you write this book?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. So essentially, the book, I would say, challenges some of the ways people commonly think about issues relating to law and human rights and childhood. And it focuses on Israel-Palestine, but I guess the arguments are broader than that. So in terms of what made me write it, I guess thinking about it in retrospect, because it's been a very long process, I would say that certain ways in which people think about these issues, I have come to challenge. So I'll give you some examples of that. For example, Israel is often accused of just disregarding international law and especially international human rights law, and even more specifically, the rights of the child under international law. That's a very common criticism. What the book shows is that rather than disregarding these legal and human rights framework, what Israel has been doing for a long time, and increasingly so, it's actually drawing on legal arguments and legal principles to shape and justify its conduct. So rather than just ignoring the law and human rights, it's been using them as tools, in a sense. So that argument, there is already critical literature out there on some of the pitfalls of human rights and law, but the book kind of adds to that in the Israeli-Palestinian context, but it also focuses on child rights and child law, which is something that people haven't considered so much in this context. Yeah. Another thing that made me write the book is wanting to challenge common assumptions about childhood. People tend to think that the children are naturally this or naturally that, and naturally different from adults. And I wanted to complicate some of those assumptions because, as the book shows, these assumptions also end up justifying harm to Palestinians, often neglect and harm. Finally, another thing that made me want to write the book is a certain legal topics that has been neglected, and that's the military courts in Palestine, the Israeli military courts, which is something that people haven't analyzed the judgments of these courts, but Israeli courts prosecute thousands of Palestinians every year, including hundreds of Palestinian children. So that's not the only legal context that the book deals with, but it's a central one. And that's another contribution that the book tries to make, shed light on a legal site that previously hasn't been sufficiently explored.
You spoke about children being naturally presumed as either this or that. Would you like to shed more light?
We as a society, contemporary society, we have a set of assumptions about children, and these assumptions are both enshrined in international law, and they're also reinforced by international law. And there's a huge body of scholarship that legal scholars and to some extent human rights scholars aren't sufficiently engaging with. And that literature has questioned some of our assumptions about childhood, drawing on historical and anthropological and sociological and other studies, kind of complicating that story a bit. So what the book tries to do is ask questions about the extent to which these presumed attributes are really that universal and natural, or whether they're actually characteristics that are largely the product of the law itself. Maybe the law creates, to a large extent, these differences that we then assume are just pre-given and natural and universal. But I think another layer that the book adds to that is that these assumptions about differences can then very easily be used as a weapon against disempowered communities. Now, in my work, both in the book and elsewhere, I've written not only about how these assumptions are used against Palestinians, but also against colonized peoples elsewhere, for example, in other countries, but specifically in relation to Palestinian children and Palestinian adults. I show, for example, how a series of reforms that Israel has introduced, following sustained pressure from the human rights community, a series of reforms that seem or are presented as serving the best interest of the child in line with international legal standards, how these reforms actually end up harming Palestinian children, and at the same time, how they legitimize harshness and apathy towards Palestinian adults. So seemingly benevolent and natural and self-evident assumptions are both questionable and potentially harmful. That's part of what the book shows.
So going off what you said about children in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, would you say that, the conditions in this conflict have, made it possible for children to be more, exposed to crime? Or
I think the way the book speaks about these issues is slightly different, because I think if we think about it as an issue of crime and state crime, there's an assumption here that the law, that what we're seeing, that the problem is the opposite of the law. If only the law was respected, then there wasn't this issue. And I think that is based on an assumption that lawfulness and violence are two opposite things. Whereas the book is part of a kind of a critical tradition that highlights the violence of the law itself. So rather than thinking about it as a matter of crime, I would say that there's certainly a lot of state violence. And part of the problem of that state violence is that it's very deeply legalized, meaning it uses the law as one of its tools. Although certainly many people would say that these are crimes, but I think that's an argument in a sense that's very convenient for Israel, because then Israel can deploy all of its lawyers and say, no, it's actually not a crime. Here are all these legal arguments showing why it's not a crime. So it becomes a very legalistic, technical debate rather than a broader political debate about what's just and what are the broader structural issues, if you see what I mean.
Yes. So would you say that the findings in your book are unique only to Israel-Palestine, or could we see something like this happening in other countries?
I think in some respects, certainly some of the things are unique to Israel-Palestine. For example, I mentioned the military courts earlier, right? And I mentioned that Israel prosecutes hundreds of Palestinian children in military courts every year. That is quite unique. You don't have that elsewhere. There have been cases of countries prosecuting children in military tribunals, but not on such a large scale at all. We could see in Guantanamo a handful of children being detained by the US as part of its war on terror, and in many other countries, Egypt, Thailand, and various other countries, but not on not such a large scale. So that's just one example of the uniqueness of the issues that I'm talking about. At the same time, certainly some of the issues are, I would say, relevant far beyond. And in my work beyond this book, part of what I try to do is consider what's unique to Israel, Palestine, or to other countries, but also what are more global trends. I have a few articles, for example, about torture. And there I wrote about Israel, Palestine, but I also wrote about other countries such as the US and the UK and Syria, especially, and showing how all these countries in different ways actually have fashioned their arguments and tactics around torture based on the law as they would like to deploy them. Now, these are very different countries with different cultures, different political regimes, right? Syria, Israel, the US and the UK are very different. And we might assume that some of them would be more inclined to engage with the law, whereas others would not. But actually, what my work shows is that this is a broader trend, even though it plays out differently in different contexts. And similarly, some of the issues I've been talking about with you in relation to children are applicable far beyond Israel, Palestine, and they're actually not unique to armed conflict. Issues around how some of these assumptions about children can be utilized against children, supposedly in their best interest, are applicable to contexts involving child refugees and child work and child custody. So certainly, I think what we're seeing here is a unique case, but also an opportunity to think critically about broader issues.
And lastly, what lessons do you expect, or did you hope that your book would be able to pass across?
I think really kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about trying to complicate some of the ways in which we think about these issues. I think some of the lessons are about rethinking our assumptions. For example, we tend to think of human rights violating states as one side of the equation versus human rights organizations as the other side. Part of what the book shows is that actually there's a lot of overlap sometimes in the sort of courses of action that they promote. Sometimes they agree on more than we would imagine. For example, one of the things I show in Israel, Palestine, is that human rights organizations often, in order to convince the Israeli authorities to do this or that, they justify what they're proposing by portraying Palestinian adults, for example, as a potential security threat to children. So essentially, they're using the same language that Israeli authorities are using, right? Sometimes they even present or describe Palestinian children as a potential security threat. They say, for example, that if Palestinian children are not separated from adults in prisons, these children would become traumatized, and that trauma would turn them into terrorists, for example. So we see the same language of national security that the state uses being adopted by human rights organizations, which supposedly are against this language. As well as the way in which they often describe adult men as non-vulnerable, non-deserving of protection, which is very convenient for states that end up harming these adults. So that's one example of how of a lesson about how complicated this is, but there are many others in the book. So hopefully people reading it will be confused a bit because it challenges conventional wisdom, but hopefully will gain some insights moving forward.
Just a quick one. You mentioned how I think the issue is that we need to change how we are, perceiving these concepts or how we understand these concepts. But what other, would you say, recommendation would you have for this kind of situation?
One thing that the book shows is that often the policies promoted by the state as well as by human rights organizations ignore what children themselves are saying, and sometimes are contrary to what children are saying. For example, in chapter 5, I quote Palestinian children repeatedly, and I show how one of the reforms I was alluding to earlier was about separating these children from adults, supposedly to protect them, even though Palestinian adults in prison actually are the ones protecting them from the Israeli prison authorities. And what you see is that when you actually read what Palestinian children are saying, you see that they themselves speak in quite a positive manner about these adults. And I'm talking about testimonies from when the children and adults were still detained together. So if we actually see what children are saying, that's a positive, that's a concrete thing that we could actually do. The problem is that oftentimes what children are saying doesn't align with preconceptions that people have about what's in the best interest of children. It's too messy. The fascinating thing is that these quotes that I provide are actually from human rights reports. So what you see is a human rights report quoting a child and then completely ignoring what the child is saying and promoting something that runs contrary to what they're saying. So I think that's one very simple lesson. I think part of the problem is also that our assumptions are not sensitive enough to the context. So I think instead of people just bringing their own ideologies, their own preconceptions, and imposing them on a context they might not be that familiar with, first of all, it's really important to study the context and see what serves the interests of each individual there. What do these people actually want? What are their political interests, right? And not divorcing legal principles from political issues. So those are some of the concrete steps that we could take.
Thank you.